Hello and welcome to the Organic Gardening Podcast. I'm Fiona Taylor and I'm joined by my colleagues at Garden Organic, Chris Collins and Marcin Salnikow. We've come in from a slightly dreary winter's day to share our jobs for December, reflect on what the 2022 growing season gave us, and look ahead to what we'll be doing next year. For this month's podcast, I had the pleasure of chatting to chef and passionate organic advocate Sophie Grigson. Sophie moved to Puglia in the south of Italy a few years ago and shares with me her experience of this change of scenery, particularly the local enthusiasm for the food that grows so well there. Later on, we'll be answering your questions on how and when to prune a wildlife-friendly native hedge, composting if you have a limited number of different components, and using up fallen apples. But before we get started, I'd like to thank our sponsors, the Organic Gardening Catalogue. This month, they have a special offer for listeners of 12 raspberry autumn bliss plants for just £12 at organiccatalogue.com/POD9, saving a fantastic £23. That's organiccatalogue.com/POD9 to claim your special offer. And now I'm off to join Chris in the potting shed. Hello, Chris, how are you?
I'm very good, Fiona. How are you?
Yeah, I'm very well indeed. Here we are, early December. Doesn't really feel terribly wintry, does it? Although the trees have finally lost their leaves.
I always think to myself, we just need a few cold snaps, to keep the cycle going, to get rid of the overwintering aphids, that kind of thing. Kill a few slug eggs. I know that's a terrible thing to say, but you want the numbers to be reasonable next year. And if the winter's too long and too mild, then that's not such a good thing. A couple of weeks of frost will sort it, basically. You don't want it to be this sort of wet and mild the whole time.
So what have you been up to down at the allotment?
Well, I've been a bit carried away down there, to be honest with you, because I thought I'd re-landscape it. I think I haven't really touched it for 4 odd years in the system I've had it in for now. And I get all my wood secondhand. I am a bit of a skip surfer, so I'll go around, I'll collect wood, I'll beg and borrow it where I can. I try not to spend any money on it. So a lot of it was quite rotten. I took it all up, so I thought, well, I'll put in new paths, do the beds, because I like individual beds. I split them up, maybe 12 of them on the site.
Do you have wood edging round each?
Wood edging with pegs, yeah, as rectangles or squares, basically.
Okay, so it's not a raised bed, is it? It's just demarcating an area.
Yeah, exactly. But I kind of thought I'd do it and then retain some of my crops and keep a bit of it. But that never happened. I completely re-landscaped the whole thing, which is typical of me because I just get carried away. I love it down there, and so it's been quite nice. And it looks amazing. It is like the perfect blueprint for an allotment.
Oh, I want to see some pictures. It sounds absolutely picture perfect. All ready and all sorted. So tell us about your those beds we've just been talking about and what you tend to plant through those.
Well, what I'll do is I have said on this podcast many a time, my allotment wasn't touched for years, so there's a massive perennial weed problem on there that I kind of have to deal with. But the bottom is where it's really bad, so I will have what I call my perennial crops down there. I might mypex them, which is a kind of covering I'd put over and plant through. But the rest, you're looking at beds, I would say, that are 1.5 by 1.5 or 2 metres by 2 metres, and then I have pathways running between them, and that kind of makes it all more workable. If you have a full-size allotment and you don't do that, it can look rather daunting. So it's about segregating my growing spaces, so psychologically I can kind of concentrate on each bit individually, and it really, really works. It really does. But the rest I will rotate. So I'll start off with legumes in one corner, then I'll butt them up. So I'll put in a system where I can move them round every time.
It's important not to get overwhelmed, isn't it? And not to feel like where do you start? Well,
I certainly think, I'm being funny, when I first gutted the allotment over, when I took it over, you could have got a bus from one end to the other, because the full-size allotment is quite huge. And if you're thinking of getting one and you're not a massive expert on it, then share it with 2 or 3 other people, split it up. It is about making each area not so daunting, basically. On your mind, it makes a big difference if you've got little bits of it that you can concentrate on each time.
I mean, you talked a little bit about the rotation. I just want to revisit that for a minute, because it's the kind of thing that puts people off, because they think, oh gosh, that's all a bit technical. Do I really need to rotate? And there is sort of, a growing movement of people saying, don't bother, just bung it in the ground and grow it. You're a rotation man, aren't you?
Yeah, I suppose in a way I may be guilty of the fact I'm quite a traditional horticulturist. I've been doing it for a while, so maybe I'm guilty of that. But all I'm going to do is not grow the same crop on the same spot. That helps with a few things. It stops any kind of club root, that kind of thing, any sort of soil-borne organisms that are likely to establish if the same crop is growing there year after year. But also it's a fertilizer thing. But there is permaculture, so you can plant multiple things in multiple layers. That's fine. I wouldn't discourage that. But I kind of go for quite a high produce allotment.
And it's all about making sure that the soil is left in the best condition for the next crop, isn't it?
Exactly. So you're working that soil. So you're using it as a fertilizer mean, as a way of conditioning the soil to make sure it aerates properly, make sure it drains properly. So you are just working that soil, and those plants will do that job for you. And the idea of rotation is it helps you in that process.
I think it sounds brilliant, actually. And I mean, I do it myself. I'm not as rigid as you. I've got a kind of a great big veg bed, and I sort of move things around in a very sort of rough fashion. And then if I've got a few holes, I bung a few flowers in. I do aspire to being a little bit more organised. But I mean, that of course is when we're focusing on veg particularly. Of course, it's coming around to that time of year now where we're thinking about flowers and getting flowers ready for the spring. And I think somebody told me you might have already got all your bulbs in, Chris, which I'm very, very embarrassed because I haven't got any in yet. So is it too late for me?
I wouldn't think so. I think you can get away with putting bulbs in the ground definitely before Christmas if you can. I mean, in an ideal world, you'd get them in October, November. Say November's the prime month. But I don't think you've missed the boat. I've put them in really kind of late and they've still come through. They're very resilient plants. And it's also, this is kind of their time, because the best thing about doing it is, especially on my balcony, it's now given me a look forward. It's, that's in the pipeline. When the dark days come right in, you go, well, that's coming. I mean, you can still get them. You can certainly get organic ones online still. A few weeks left before that chance totally folds.
Do you have a problem with squirrels digging them up in the pots?
Well, I'm lucky. I'm about 2 meters away from the tree line, and I see the squirrels in there, and I think you better not come on this balcony. And they haven't come yet, and I think it's just enough distance. But and this has happened to me a lot, if you're having problems with that, buy some chicken wire, right, and then fold the chicken wire over the top of the pot, tuck it in tight, and that will protect your bulbs, because they will, especially hyacinths. They love hyacinths for some reason. It also helps maybe if you plant pansy or forget-me-not or wallflower on top of your bulbs, because then you've given it some vegetative cover. And then you have that beautiful combination of spring flower off those plants with a bulb coming through in a tiered effect. Very beautiful.
We just talked a little bit about chicken wire, and obviously you can whip that off once the bulbs start coming through, because it's not the most of sightly.
It doesn't look very beautiful.
It doesn't look very good, no. but these are useful things, covering the soil, covering paths. I myself have been covering my gravel paths. I've got some old shed felt off the roof, and I just roll it out. I've got quite a long path down one side of the garden, and it's gravel, and it just gets all sorts of seedlings in it. And I just think that's probably quite an easy way of getting through the winter, and knowing that come the spring, flowers are out, I can take the covering off the path, and it just sets the garden off beautifully. But you've been covering the soil on the allotment. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, well, I think that I got carried away. I think in an ideal world, I should probably landscape my allotment late February, early March, because what's happened now is I've exposed the soil. There's nothing in the allotment, and what happens is if you get heavy rains, damages the soil structure. It certainly, you get a problem with leaching. We've talked about that before, where the nutrient is washed through to the subsoil. So I need to kind of protect. I need to make up for my error a little bit, to be honest with you. I am now in the shops of Palmer's Green as we speak, hassling people for cardboard. So I'll put that down to protect the surface. I'll put my Mypex down, which is a cover I use a lot. I'll pin that down just to protect that soil until it's ready for me to start planting again. It's
incredible, really, isn't it, that we have these methods that mean that you can not only protect the soil, but you can also recycle and reuse cardboard in a way that actually benefits the environment, which is absolutely brilliant. So it's the end of the year, so it's always worth looking back, isn't it, and thinking, okay, what did we do that went okay? What didn't go so well? What were your triumphs of the year? Let's focus on the positive for a minute.
Well, I suppose my balcony, which is south-facing in London, which is a warm city these days, that was incredible, because I plant a lot of summer bedding. So a lot of colour, but I also plant my food crops on the balcony are the Mediterranean type plants. Aubergine, I'm brilliant year for aubergine. Tomato, I've had an incredible amount of chilies. I'm looking at them here now. They're all drying in bowls. And so that balcony really did well this year. And I think that was because it enjoyed the heat. Basically, the plants I put out there like the heat. And as long as I was out there for 10 minutes in the morning, making sure it all got the water it needed, and I picked it over and I fed it, then they all did really well. The allotment was a different challenge altogether, just because a lot of the temperate plants did not like that heat at all. Runner bean, which like kind of like cooler start, that seemed to struggle. I've talked to a lot of gardeners who said the same thing. My salad crops, which I normally get loads of those, just bolted, and the spinach just bolted. When I say bolt, I mean they just wanted to set seed. They weren't interested in giving me the crop. So it was quite a challenging year on the allotment compared to the balcony.
But when you came to sort of doing the work you've just done, you must have had some crops you had to deal with there and then. I mean, if you were just doing that in the last few weeks.
I did. I used a little trick that I learned from an old boy in Stoke. I did a TV series years ago, Britain's Best Allotment. And I went to Stoke and I asked this, and he loved his parsnips and his carrots, this guy. And what he did is he got an old water barrel, and then what he'd do is in layers he'd put sand, crop. So it's a little bit like a homemade fridge in a way. If the temperatures are cool, he put that in the shed, and he said he could graze those crops. So I've done that with my parsnip. I've done it with red cabbage. I've got loads of those. They're amazingly beautiful. I've got things like beets. I love my beetroot, and they're all in this barrel in layers with some sand, and that will hopefully preserve them, because my freezer here is definitely not big enough.
So that's in your shed on the allotment, is it?
That's in my shed, yeah.
I've always wanted to do it, never managed to do it. And I knew you could do it with roots in particular, but I didn't realise you could do it with cabbage.
Well, I am experimenting a little bit because I've not tried it with cabbage, but they're quite solid objects. So I will come back to you if they survive.
But then we must report back on this, because it's important to know. But actually, I had a little bit of success with storage that I was very proud of. So I, like you said, the beans were a bit late and a little bit slower than expected. So actually, I didn't harvest them when they were the full pod. I left them on the plant. And this is my climbing French bean. And I harvested them only a few weeks ago and shelled them and had these beautiful white beans. I mean, the climbing French bean Blue Lake was the variety, but the bean looks like a haricot bean. I mean, it's absolutely gorgeous. And I've got a jar of beans ready to make a casserole in the winter. I'm so proud of that. And actually really inspired to do more of that, growing more beans for storage in the years to come. So satisfying.
That's nice to be able to dip into that in mid-February, isn't it, when you're not really thinking about beans normally?
Absolutely. I'm beginning to think about next year. Have you got any big plans?
Well, I'm grazing the catalogues. I kind of think between now and probably the end of January, like the idea of sitting down with the organic gardening catalogue or the HSL catalogue and deciding what I'm going to go do next year. And I think that's quite exciting. It puts you in the mood. So I'll try some new varieties.
That's all part of the fun. Although I do need some advice, Chris, because as you know, I put in the pond beginning of the year. It's been a huge success. Absolutely loved it. I really want to put some lovely marginals around it and get more flowers in that part of the garden. So quite a shady pond. It's under the trees. It looks absolutely fabulous. What would you recommend?
Well, there's some beautiful plants to use. A big favourite of mine, Rodgersia. You can grow them in a different kind of environments, but they're in herbaceous. There's one called Asclepifolia, which has this amazing horse chestnut-like leaves with these big plumes of white flower. Plant them in drifts, Fiona, so never in wands. Plant them in 3s and 5s, so you get that kind of natural drift. Penstamens, they're brilliant pond-side plant. Obviously, hostas, if you kind of give them a little bit of shade. I quite like the idea of amelanchias, multi-stemmed amelanchias, underplanted with these plants. So you get this dappled shade, and then you get these drifts of quite beautiful looking herbaceous plants that light their feet down. Astilbes is another brilliant plant for a pond side. If you want something to give you a big bit of height, I like to undulate my plants in rudbeckias, and they will flower absolutely non-stop.
That's amazing. I never thought of rudbeckias by the pond, because they strike me as such a hot flower,
They love it next to a pond, and you get so many varieties of them. And we associate them with herbaceous borders, and that's where you get that impression of heat, etc. But they will sit with their feet in moist soil quite happily, and then give you a bit of height, and then obviously flower non-stop.
I wonder if there's any edibles I should be thinking about as part of my marginals.
Well, I wonder, quite a lot of stuff, if you put it in the back a little bit, maybe think about perennials like Jerusalem artichoke, stuff like that. You might be able to put them near ponds because they're quite resilient as well.
Okay. I'm going to have lots of fun. I will report back and let you know how I get on. But I better crack on and find out where I can get hold of some of those plants. I mean, I guess I will have to buy those in. I don't think I can grow any of those from seed, can I?
Well, you might be. Rebecca, you could grow from seed, or they are a bit touchy. That's a good challenge, isn't it? Because if you get one on the go, yeah, that's fine. But maybe hedge your bets and buy one in as well. I won't name names, but if you can grow to a herbaceous temperate grower that's in the UK, there are plenty of them, and they'll grow stuff, and you have an advantage then because they'll already be acclimatised. If you're buying something from Italy or whatever that's coming in, or Holland, it's been grown in a different environment. Whereas if you're buying off a British grower in this country who's exposing it to British conditions, you'll get a better plant.
And I will go and do my research because there's a lot of organic nurseries that really need our support, and I really want to go and spend my money there. That's what I'll do.
Try and avoid your DIYs and go to a local grower would be my advice for a bit of sustainability.
And also a good place to go if you want to buy somebody a Christmas present. What's on your Christmas list, Chris?
Well, I'm going to, if I can, give out bare root trees. And that's the best gift of all. I was in Edinburgh last week talking to apprentices. I put up this slide at the beginning of the first tree I ever planted, which is an enormous augustifolia, like an elm, a Cornish elm. And that elm will live 600 years, long after I'm not about. In such a temporary, transitional world, I think that's quite a special gift.
It certainly is. Well, my absolute hope is that people will give me terracotta pots because I am trying to switch out plastic. I think the plants definitely do better. The oxygen exchange is better for the roots. They don't sort of gather the water in the bottom of the pots. And I'm also keen to transfer my houseplants over to terracotta as well because they're not doing so well. And I think that's probably key to encouraging them to do a bit better.
Yeah, all roots need oxygen. It's interesting because you remember when it comes to plants, you talk about plants need carbon dioxide and but actually roots need oxygen. So the thing about terracotta is it's porous, so you will get that exchange, and that will certainly the house plants that will definitely help.
Well, I hope you do get everything for Christmas that you want, Chris.
If I get roast dinner, I'll be happy with that, Fiona, to be honest with you.
With your parsnips and carrots. Absolutely.
Oh, yeah, exactly. I'll report back on the red cabbage when I dig it out for Christmas Day.
I'm really looking forward to that. That's going to brighten up our January podcast. We'll look forward to that. Our special guest this month is longtime supporter of Garden Organic, chef and food writer Sophie Grigson, an enthusiastic advocate of organic food. Sophie's written over 20 cookbooks and has always been particularly passionate about vegetables. Now residing in Italy, Sophie has set about discovering more vegetables, including a broccoli-like one called Cimi di Rapa, which she urges us all to grow, 60 local varieties of cherry tomato in her region of Italy alone, and the joy of eating slices of cucamelon alongside pasta. During the interview, we discuss a couple of recipes, and we'll be giving you more information on those later in the show. I thoroughly enjoyed getting to know Sophie a little more when she joined me on a slightly ropey internet connection from the southernmost region of Italy. Sophie, thank you so much for agreeing to come and talk to us here at Garden Organic.
It's a pleasure.
You have written a lot about vegetables over the years, and going back 20 or so years, a book called Organic, A New Way of Eating. It's interesting now to think that perhaps it's not so new, is it? But can you just talk a little bit about what caught your interest with the organic movement, way back then?
I think at the time, I just had my children, so I had young children. And I think that for many people, I think, when you're a new parent, you're suddenly much more aware of what your food is, where it comes from, what's in it. And you want to give your children, but particularly when they're very young, you want to give them something that is nutritionally the best, that doesn't contain things that you don't understand, all those chemicals. And so for me, the organic movement just made a lot of sense, really. Kind of as simple as that. And I want to explore more about what the organic movement is doing and what organic growing of fruit and veg in particular, what it's about and where it's come from. And so it was a really interesting time in my life, and it was a very exciting period, I think, for the organic movement then, because it was beginning to flourish in a way that it hadn't before.
And a huge amount of support at the time from King Charles.
Yeah, absolutely. He was extraordinary when you think about it, to have picked up and espoused the whole organic way of growing way before it was fashionable. And I have huge praise for him for doing that. So, yes, the organic movement, it felt like it was just really beginning to blossom.
It's very interesting that you say that having children made you sort of think about, maybe looking at the labels a bit more closely and making those choices for organic. And we hear that a lot. And the other time we hear that people start to think carefully about organic practice is if they're growing some of their own fruit and veg, and suddenly they think, oh, hang on a minute, I don't want to spray this. Crikey, I'm going to be eating it. And it's almost like there's those 2 points where the penny really drops. Quite often what then happens is people then think, oh, okay, hang on a minute. Well, if I'm not going to spray my raspberries, then why would I spray my roses? And then it sort of builds from there. But it's really interesting. You now live in Italy, and I'm talking to you across the ether between Ryton Gardens and Puglia, right at the south of Italy. Do you want to tell us a little bit about where you live right now?
Yes, I live in Italy's heel, Puglia. I live in the middle of it, and it's beautiful. It's very beautiful. I moved here about 3.5 years ago, and I just love it. It's still got a lot of very sort of old-fashioned values, but it's an area where fruit and vegetables in particular grow with abundance. The quality of fruit and veg down here is fantastic. And people eat a lot of greens.
And it must have been the food culture really that, must have intrigued you at the first instance.
Totally. When I first arrived, I thought that I knew quite a lot about Italian cooking. And it turns out that what I knew about was really more northern. Coming down here, it made me realise, it really brought home to me how regional Italian cooking is. And you're never more than 10 minutes away from a pizzeria here. There are lots of pizzerias, but Italian food is very regional, and Puglia is very proud of its homegrown dishes, very proud of its produce, very proud of its olive oil. The Puglian cuisine comes out of intense poverty. I mean, really up until the First World War, and probably later, probably up to the Second World War, it was, really shockingly poor. So the cooking is very much about making the most of what you've got. It's about fruit and veg, which you could grow yourself. It's about, lots of beans and pulses, which are very cheap and nutritious and filling. It wasn't pasta country. This was bread. Bread was the main kind of stomach filler here. Now everybody eats pasta all the time. On the coast, fish as well. But it is curious. I live 20 minutes drive from the coast, and I'm in meat territory. This is inland.
That is so interesting, isn't it? Yeah. So actually, fish really, you've got to be able to see the sea if you want to get your fresh fish. So going back to that sort of cultural heritage of, as you say, extreme poverty, the key, of course, has been that people were cooking what they could get their hands on, but there doesn't seem to be any compromise on flavour, particularly in that part of the world.
No, the Puglians don't much do bland. They can cope a lot out of something very simple. One of the things that I learned very early on was that cherry tomatoes are for cooking with. They're not a salad tomato here.
Oh, how interesting.
Which is very interesting. And they use them quite judiciously. You get recipes where for 4 people, where there will be 12 cherry tomatoes in it. Is this a mistake? That's not enough. But they use them as a seasoning. So it'll be to accent for a little bit of acidity, a little bit of background for it. Just enough to highlight other flavours. So it's a very clever way of cooking. It's not just about chuck a whole lot in. It's something that's evolved gradually to make the most of small amount. There's also here a variety of tomatoes, large cherry tomatoes, that keep through the winter.
Ah, so you can store them.
Yeah, and they're not dried. They are strung up in bunches. They look beautiful. And they last through February or March, just hung up.
And you just pluck off when as you need.
Yeah. And
they still, they seem fleshy. They don't.
Yeah, they're absolutely fleshy. They tend to be not as sweet, and they have slightly thicker skins. But yes, they last all the way through the winter.
we have an awful lot of tomatoes in our heritage seed library here.
I'm glad to hear that.
And so people are very fascinated by tomatoes amongst our members. I know myself, I grew 4 different types this year that I'd never grown. But of course, I just sort of feel like they must just be sort of everywhere where you are. I mean, tomatoes just must be in such abundance.
Yes, everywhere. I mean, I went to a tomato tasting recently, a local organic grower, and he had 15 varieties of tomatoes there, most of them cherry tomatoes. He is saying to me he thinks there are about 60 different varieties of cherry tomatoes grown in Puglia alone.
60? 60?
60, yes. 60.
Good grief. And going to a tomato tasting a thing, generally, in Puglia?
Well, I don't think particularly, but they are. One of the things I love here, they're so proud of their local produce, of what they grow here, of Puglian cooking, of their own culture. I mean, sometimes it can be a bit frustrating to try and bring something else in from outside and whoa, foreign food. But I do love this passion for their own produce. A lovely little corner cafe, which is tiny, and it's very much a workman's cafe. Does very good coffee. Now, sometimes I sit there and I'll be listening to the guys, and they'll be discussing food. But they will be discussing how you should make one particular dish in a way that you'd never hear the same thing in the UK. They all have an opinion about whether you should put this in, whether you should put the other in. It's great.
Isn't that interesting that actually that cooking is so much a way of life that people are just sitting in bars chatting about it? I think that's fascinating. So paint us a picture of the sort of landscape around you and what is growing, what you see growing.
There are olive trees everywhere. It's the colour of the countryside. That silver grey is the dominant colour out of the countryside. But there's a lot of almond trees growing, apricots, cherries, cherry trees, and cherries are massive down here. So you see all kinds of fruit trees. Further north, there's not so much wheat down here. Further north in Puglia, there's wheat. Around me, there's also quite a lot of market gardens, people growing tomatoes, chilies, a lot of chilies growing as well. It's very green. I mean, in the height of summer, it becomes brown. People are quite surprised by how green it is here. And I think that's partly because we're surrounded by sea. So we've got the Adriatic on one side, we've got the Ionian on the other. So we have quite a moist climate. Although curiously, there are no rivers. Well, that's not totally true. There are no visible rivers. Water flows underground.
Which, of course, must affect the water table, which then in turn will affect the soil and affect the growing conditions. So that's really interesting. So do people garden it? Do people have gardens? Is it a thing?
Oh, it's very much a thing. Local people tend to have a town place, to live in town, and to have a piece of land further out, where you spend a lot of time in the summer. They have their gardens, but they're not necessarily attached to the house.
So it's almost like a sort of summer allotment that you would go to?
Yes, exactly. It's that kind of thing. And there people will grow all kinds of fruit and veg. And it's also where they retreat to in the summer heat. And the whole family will go there and have a great shindig. They're also, the other thing they are very, very keen on here is foraging. They are massive foragers here.
I was going to ask you about that. That's interesting. Yeah, okay, tell us more. What would you forage for?
Well, when I first became aware of foraging was, curiously enough, during our first lockdown of COVID. I moved here about 9 months before COVID. And curiously, that is the time when wild asparagus is growing in the fields. I was quite impressed by how law-abiding the Italians were. However, we were allowed out for necessary outings for shopping and things like that. And I think the Italians consider picking wild asparagus a thing of necessity.
And wild asparagus are they quite a lot thinner? Is that right? I'm trying to visualise.
It's very different in look to garden asparagus. So they're very thin, really delicious. People occasionally are handing me a bag that was full of wild asparagus that they've just been out picking. I know when my downstairs neighbour has a very nice campagna. They go out and pick wild rocket. They forage for all kinds of things. Wild greens, bitter greens. The Pugliese are known, I think, originally rather disparagingly, as mangiafolie, leaf eaters. And they eat phenomenal amounts of green leafy vegetables. They just love green leafy vegetables. And the one that they eat the most of is Cimi di Rapa, which, if you don't grow it, grow some.
So what is it? No, you're going to have to give us a bit more information here. So what actually is this mysterious green leaf?
It's often translated, the name is often translated into English as turnip tops. And that is very stupid and very confusing because they are not the green bits at the top of turnips. And anyway, who knows what turnip tops means in the UK anyway. So I think look for something called either Cimi di Rapa or rapini. And being Italy, there are about 1 million different names for it. It's sort of like a bit similar to purple sprouting broccoli. They have the little florets, but much more green leaf. And it's got a very slight bitterness, which is a flavour that the Pugliese love. They love hints of bitterness in food.
Fantastic. What an interesting vegetable. We've now learned a whole new vegetable. I'm excited to hear about that. That's amazing. You have a little balcony as well, I think. Is that right?
I have a very nice little house in the middle of town with a balcony. So I grow a few things like balcony. But I have lots of friends out in the countryside. So I can go and get my countryside fix, enjoy the olive oil, and I don't have to do any of the work.
You've got it made, I think, probably.
Yeah.
Tell us what you do on your balcony.
I have basil, which is still just about going. It's getting colder here now, so I might harvest it all and make some pesto or basil puree and freeze that. I have mint. I usually have thyme and I've got sage. I've got lemongrass.
That's very interesting that you would do well with lemongrass. But I mean, that must go back to what we were saying before about the greenery and how much sort of humidity there is around.
Yeah. Yes, and it loves it. I mean, it's very happy here.
Now, you have just made this TV series that's been airing on the Food Network called Slice of Italy. It looks like terrific fun, I have to say.
It is an odd thing, really, for a foreigner to come in and to cook Italian food. People pitched in with enormous enthusiasm. I think they kind of take it for granted that other people ought to enjoy it and ought to be interested in it as well.
We imagine, of course, lots of pasta, lots of pizza, which I think is probably a fair enough thing to imagine. But are there any other surprises that sort of appear on the table when you sit down to eat?
Oh, yes. Yes. Antipasti, mixed antipasti is where you find the really interesting things a lot of the time. There are quite a lot of vegetables that I've not come across before. So one of the things, when I first arrived here, I noticed these sort of little round, size of a large orange and green melony things. I didn't know what they were. And eventually I asked, and they said, oh yeah, that's a baratiere. And there's another version, very similar, called carosella. And these are cucumber melons, but they're eaten alongside pasta.
So it sort of cuts through the glutinous,
yes.
or yes.
Yes, so the sort of richness or the farinaceous nature of pasta. And they're just eaten, they're just peeled and sliced, and they're put in a bowl in the middle of the table. People just grab a piece and eat it alongside the pasta dish. So that's very, very common down here. So I hadn't come across that at all. They grow very easily. That was totally new to me.
And this tradition of having something sort of fresh and seasonal as you're eating.
Yes, absolutely. So you might have sticks of celery on the table, or you might have very crisp lettuce. There's something green and refreshing, which tends to be not served as a salad as we might. So it's not dressed, it's just put there and you just grab a piece and eat it alongside your pasta. So that was quite a surprise. The other things that I found here, there are very long snake beans.
So green, sort of like a green French bean, but really long.
Like a green French bean, but long. So they're about as long as your arm.
But not in the runner bean league, sort of more in the French bean league.
Much more French bean style. Yeah, absolutely. So they're cooked. They're often cooked with pasta. The guy in the market stall, you have to cook them with the spaghetti, not with other kinds of pasta. But it works very well. So I chuck them in the pan with the pasta. And the other thing they have a lot of here, and I guess this comes out of tense poverty, so much so that a lot of people were day labourers, that their main meal would be a big slice of bread with maybe an onion. And so bread is a big mainstay. Lots of recipes with bread in it, because no bit of bread is ever allowed to go to waste. A lot of dishes with vegetables in it. A lot of pasta dishes with pulses in them. So this sort of carb-on-carb thing is quite common here. So you get a lot of pasta and chickpea recipes, pasta with cooked with lentils, and Sophie has some lentil-y sludge. And it does look like sludge, but it tastes terrific. So a lot of pulses grown here as well, and ones which I hadn't come across before, like black chickpeas.
Black chickpeas. I've never heard of that, and so that's a really good one on me. I mean, I'm delighted to say that next year I plan to grow my own chickpeas because I have learned how to do that being here at Garden Organic, because we grow them here. And so I'm really thrilled to try and grow some of my own next year. But black chickpeas, I think I need to do some further research.
Do some further research. They are very nice. They kind of don't taste.
And borlotti beans, of course, picked fresh and all those sorts of things, Yes.
Love borlotti beans.
You have written a lot about vegetables over the years, and, you must be now sort of in seventh heaven, really, with so much abundance around you.
Oh, yes. Yes, totally. Yes, I know. I think vegetables are so much more interesting to cook with than meat. And my second book was called Eat Your Greens.
So I remember that, with you looking very stern on the front cover. Eat your greens.
Eat your greens, yes. So the vegetables are so interesting. I mean, they're different textures, huge range of textures, huge range of flavours, lots of different colours. The shapes are so interesting, so beautiful. And there's just so much potential, and you can do so many interesting things with vegetables. Vegetables just, it's an endless world of possibilities. When you think of a vegetable like an aubergine, which adapts to, if it's cooked well, take on the veg spices and the flavours that you put into it. Stuffed, I love stuffing, but also maybe thinly slivered and fried. They also do a carpaccio. Sometimes I've eaten a carpaccio of aubergine, which is just a fancy way of saying very, very thinly sliced and eaten raw. Cut in olive oil, and maybe lemon juice, salt and pepper. It's actually very, very good. Surprisingly good.
It's interesting, isn't it, that the vegetables now are having such a moment, really, in the sun. Perhaps when you first started writing about it, perhaps it wasn't so. Is that right?
Yes, no, absolutely. And things have changed. But of course, the British have always been a nation of gardeners. I mean, you look at the allotments, look at Garden Organic. We have always grown vegetables, not always quite so good on cooking.
I think that's a really fair observation, isn't it? I think that we are passionate growers, and our temperate climate really lends itself to that. We can grow almost anything really in this country, or at least an enormous variety of things. But, so you had your prize cabbage, and then you would just boil it.
Well, it's a shame, really.
Not so now, I think. And we have a lot of people and chefs as well, interested in the Heritage Seed Library and these different types of vegetables and, unusual, different flavours. It really is another dimension. That the whole heritage variety is another whole dimension to vegetable growing, because of course they look so appealing as well, because they look different. I grew a beautiful yellow tomato this year, an Estonian cherry yellow, I think we called it. Absolutely beautiful, sort of teardrop shaped, totally delicious, but also incredibly appealing because it looked so different. Of course, one of the key ingredients to any kind of vegetable cooking is olive oil. And I would just love to hear your perspectives a little bit on the olive tree and how that must sort of inform your landscape.
Puglia is defined by olive trees. Until very recently, Puglia produced over 40% of Italy's total olive oil production.
40%.
Yeah, so the landscape is just covered. There are just olive trees everywhere. It's such a strong part of the local culture, and as on Puglia's coat of arms has an olive tree in the middle of it. It's so ingrained in people's way of life. Actually, it's more than just a tree that produces fruit that produce lots of olive oil.
And the ancient trees, the fact they live for hundreds of years and...
No, thousands of years. We have tree ships that go back 2,000, 3,000 years, which is extraordinary. To stand under one of those trees, and, some Roman peasants, they stood here. Just like me, they stood under this tree, took a break from the heat of the summer heat. I mean, it's an extraordinary thing.
I think we should just touch on the terrible Xylella disease that seems to be affecting, large numbers of trees in Puglia. And that's a massive issue, surely.
It's a tragedy. One of the problems is it's a monoculture, and a big one. So there's this disease called Xylella that arrived probably about 10 years ago, 12 years ago, and it is devastating olive trees. And it's spreading up Puglia. It's a bacteria that's carried by insects. And you drive south, and it's like driving through a war zone. It's like some terrible bomb has gone off and killed, which is, you see these kind of ghost trees, grey, I think, which were once vigorous olive trees very recently. I kind of feel, I don't know, I look on in despair. It is going to change Puglia. But this is a disease that is not just going to affect Puglia. It's going to go all the way around the Mediterranean.
It affects bay trees as well. And I know that there is an enormous sort of international effort actually to stop the transport of the disease. You know, the other interesting thing you mention is, of course, you get a region that's famous for a particular crop. And then, of course, there's hundreds or thousands and thousands of them, which then means that there isn't that diversity and there isn't that wonderful kind of organic cycle of nature sort of being able to heal its own. So yes, there's a lot of big issues, you know, behind that bottle of olive oil that we buy. And olives are a fruit, of course. It seems strange because we sort of think of them in a kind of savoury way. And I think you very kindly dug out a recipe to share with us. And since this is a sort of wintry podcast, it's quite a hearty, nice recipe. I just wonder if you could just talk us through that one.
I think you might be talking about the chocolate olive oil mousse.
And indeed I am.
Which is a very gorgeous thing indeed. Chocolate mousse, and it has olive oil mixed in. Now, you might say, why bother? Because chocolate mousse is gorgeous anyway. Well, this is just even more gorgeous chocolate mousse, and it gives it a silkiness and a richness, which is hard to define. You wouldn't eat it and think, oh, that's olive oil. I tried it on people here, and they thought it was a very odd concept until they tasted it. At which point they forgot about it being odd and just ate the whole lot. That was it.
We will make sure that we post the recipe on our website so people can find it. And another recipe you've given us contains this mystery but rather marvellous vegetable, the Cimi di Rapa. Have I got that right?
You have.
And I think it's a pasta recipe.
Yes, it is. It is, I would say it is the iconic Puglian recipe, Puglian dish. In my little town here today, I bet you there's about 1 in 3 people will be eating orecchiette alla Cimi di Rapa. So orecchiette is a little ear-shaped pasta, and the Cimi di Rapa are cooked in the same saucepan. You have to forget any concept of al dente of the vegetable. Al dente of the pasta, yes, but vegetable, the Cimi di Rapa has to begin to break down. You cook it in the same water, and then it's just finished with chili, garlic, and anchovy fried in olive oil. And that's it. It's such a simple dish. You can do it with purple sprouting broccoli, but best of all is to grow your own Cimi di Rapa as well, organically, obviously, and you will be delighted.
I'm going to find out about it. I am. I'm going to find out about it and see if I can grow it and report back. So I would conclude, Sophie, that life is good for you in Puglia. You know, what an amazing sort of growing, cooking community you've arrived into.
Life is very good here in Puglia. It's a pleasure to live here. I go out in the morning, I go to the market, or I go to vegetables, fruit and vegetable, and I count my blessings. It's the best decision I've ever made, moving to Puglia.
Sophie Grigson there talking to us from Puglia. Now, let me just walk you through the recipes that she talked about. First is pasta with Cimi di Rapa, or purple sprouting broccoli. So, the ingredient list is as follows. 300 grams of dried orecchiette, which is the local pasta, but this can be substituted with pasta shells. 800 grams of purple sprouting broccoli, or, if you can get hold of it, Cimi di Rapa. 3 cloves of garlic, 2 chilies, 6 tablespoons of extra virgin olive oil, 5 anchovies and some salt. Prepare the broccoli by trimming off the tougher stalks, then chopping the rest, including the leaves, into pieces around 3 to 4 centimetres long. Cook the pasta and the broccoli together in a pan of boiling water with a dash of salt. Whilst that's cooking, put the oil, chilies, garlic and anchovies into a frying pan. Fry gently for a few minutes until the garlic is brown, but don't let it burn. Scoop out a cup of the pasta and broccoli water and reserve that. When it's ready, you drain the pasta and the broccoli and then you add that to the frying pan. You toss it with the mixture in the pan and you loosen it all up with a slurp or two of the pasta water. Eat straight away. The second recipe is the olive oil chocolate mousse. You need 100 grams of dark chocolate, finely chopped, 2 egg yolks, 80 grams of light muscovado sugar, a pinch of salt, 4 tablespoons of extra virgin olive oil, and 3 egg whites. First of all, melt the chocolate, and then you just leave that to cool for a few minutes. Whisk the egg yolks and the sugar until the sugar has dissolved. Then add the olive oil a little at a time until you create a gorgeous thick gloop. Then you whisk in the melted chocolate a little at a time. Don't panic if the gloop shows ominous signs of graining at this point. Just carry on. Whisk the egg whites separately into soft peaks and fold into the chocolate mixture. Divide this between 4 small cups or bowls and chill for a few hours. Then, just before serving, drip a few drops of fresh olive oil over each mousse and sprinkle with a few flakes of salt. I'm certainly intending to try those recipes and I hope you do too. Just let us know how you get on. And now it's time for the postbag. We've got some cracking questions this time. And I'm joined by our head of horticulture, Chris Collins.
Hi, Fiona.
And I'm also joined by Marcin Salnikow, who is our lead horticulturalist for the Heritage Seed Library. Hi, Marcin.
Hello.
Right, we have got a really, really interesting question about hedging. It's from Sally, and she says she has a wildlife hedge with a mix of native trees, hedge plants, such as Guelder rose, hawthorn, blackthorn, beech, hazel, wild roses, wild privet, holly, and so forth. She's never really known the best time to prune it, and she's got quite a thick hedge now, but she wants to see more flowers and berries and wants to know how and when to cut it in order to achieve this. So, start us off then, Marcin, on this one.
Hi, I think the indication of the problem is in the question here. So, Sally would like to see more flowers and berries in the hedge. So that would suggest to me that the wood isn't mature enough. What I mean by that is, in order to have flowers and berries, the wood needs on the second and third year. If you keep cutting the first year, the fresh wood, then you're not going to have any flowers. So I think I would leave it alone for a few months at least. If there is an option for leaving the hedge, or at least one side of it, for a whole season, I would leave one side untouched and see what it does.
What would be the best time of year to leave it for the birds?
I think the suggestion from RSPB, between March and August, you shouldn't touch your hedges. That's the main nesting seasons. If you really have to control your hedge, between March and August, I would only use secateurs or hand shears and do a delicate pruning.
I suppose the secret is to think of it as lots of different plants, not just one kind of amorphous hedge that you might just treat like privet. And, we've all seen it, haven't we, where here's a hedge that's absolutely stuffed full of native species, but it's just been cut to within an inch of its life. And so it's just this kind of green mass. But it sounds to me like less is more with this. You need to cut less if you want more flowers and berries.
I think from the mixture, you will have many different rate of growths on it. If you have to cut it, and again, it comes down to aesthetics. If you have to cut it, just be gentle with it and go in September or after that once the birds left.
What sort of advice have you got, Chris, on this one?
Yeah, I can't agree with that. I think little and often with native hedge, you don't really want to interfere with what it's doing. It's going to be its most prosperous and the most beneficial in its most natural form, and that cuts us out to a certain degree, doesn't it? But I kind of understand in a small garden, which is what most of us have. I mean, you can even do it in pots along the front of a balcony rail if you wanted to, but that means you need to kind of contain its size. So rather than going in heavy, secateurs, just tip out the shoots at the top, keep it nice and tight, let it thicken out. Don't go too mad on it. We've kind of changed from the days where we went out with a hedge trimmer and hit a privet back and it all looked perfect around the house. And now we're trying to accommodate nature a lot more. So definitely the rule is try not to interfere with it as much as you can. But if you need to, little and often.
Okay. Well, we've got a question here from Catherine. And Catherine is interested in building some compost heaps. The materials mostly available to her are grass cuttings and leaves, but there'll also be some twigs from shrub pruning, which she's hoping to chip up before she puts them in her compost. So she's curious, should she be separating out all these different materials? Would that be beneficial? What would be your recommendation? So I'm going to come to you first, Marcin, on this.
I think there's no right and wrong with this one. You could mix them or you can keep them separately. I think having only 3 elements to it is quite tricky. You need the right balance of browns and greens. It's nitrogen and carbon that we want to have in equal parts, more or less. Ideally, with the right mix, you hit the best rate of composting. So you may end up with the compost within 6 to 12 months. Obviously, if you only have grass clippings, they're not going to do much as well. They'll just turn into slimy mess. So if you can supplement your grass clippings with cardboard or brown paper or some dried stems. With leaves, the trouble is they go through different process of composting. So they're mainly fungal activity. So it's going to be a cooler activity and it's going to take longer. That usually takes about 12 to 24 months. Depending on the lignin content in leaves, but then you end up with the leaf mold, which is a lovely additive to your growing medium, a lovely open structure.
And she's spot on with cutting up the twigs, isn't she, to try and keep that carbon, that brown material, a bit smaller, so that it mixes in nicely and aerates with the grass clippings. I mean, Chris, you're somebody who has composted many tons of grass clippings over the years.
Well, I tend to use them as an accelerant. So, yeah, I mean, I've had grounds I've looked after. I've got acres of grass, and that's a lot of clippings. So, as Marcin says, if I just put grass clippings in, it just becomes a sludge. So I would put in my weeds, my cardboard, my paper, and my allotment. I tend to do that with shredded paper and mix it together, and the grass tends to act as an accelerant because it heats up much quicker. I would definitely separate out the leaves because just there's a different process involved. If I was to miniaturise it, I'll have 3 bays on my allotment. 2 will be for composting, where I mix my browns and my greens together. Then I'll have one with chicken wire on it, and that'll be for my leaves.
If I can just add one more thing to the grass clippings, what I've done personally in my garden, and if you've got too much of it, you don't want to add all of it to the compost. We've used it as a mulch as well. So you can sprinkle it around your shrubs or your plants just to conserve some water and suppress some weeds. It works really well. Obviously, you don't want to overdo it, but I think a couple of sprinklings, couple of layers will do the trick.
Excellent. Plenty of good advice there. Our last question is from John, who says, we have a large number of fallen apples. Can we chop them up and then use them scattered on the ground, covered with black weed suppressant plastic? Could we mix them with manure? Would that be suitable then across the top of the ground? Big question. Thanks, John. Let's see what the answers are. Martin?
Yeah, I think many people have that problem with a lot of apples coming off the trees. It's a tricky question. The problem is with covering with plastic or anything around the tree, it will attract rodents underneath the suppressant plastic. I would also check the health of your tree and of your apples. May be harboring ground rot or botrytis, and so apples are susceptible to quite a lot of fungal problems. If you've got quite a lot of it and the winter's quite mild, they'll just overwinter on the ground and then reinfect your tree. So maybe from that perspective, it's probably not the best idea.
Okay, thank you. Wise words there. So, Chris, what would your advice be?
Well, I think if you're going to go to the trouble to cut the apples up and reduce the size of it, so I would probably go straight in the compost bin. That would make more sense to me rather than just covering them over with some form of plastic mulch. On the other hand, you know that nothing gets wasted in nature, so you can put your apples in a little pile and just let the slugs and the birds and everybody feed on them. Or maybe this is probably my favourite answer, is give them out, make them communal, make some cider. Or chat to your neighbours, find a way to eat them. It's frustrating how you see every year all these apples lying on the floor that no one seems to care about, that they're just wasted. And I know that most people are a bit nervous about eating anything that doesn't come in cling film or from a supermarket, but this is free food and it will taste better. Try not to waste them.
And what is better than hot apple cider around this time of year? It's such a wonderful winter drink. So yes, what a great idea. Yes, that's warmed me up, even thinking about it. Thank you, Chris. All right, well, that's all we've got time for in the postbag. Thanks ever so much to both of you. See you next time.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks. See you soon.
Before we sign off for another year and Chris disappears into his shed to unearth his Christmas cabbage, I just wanted to say a heartfelt thank you to you for listening, and for supporting our charity, Garden Organic, through 2022. We believe passionately that organic growing is the best way to tend to our gardens, allotments, and green spaces so we can protect our precious biodiversity and all the riches nature has given us. If listening to this podcast has prompted you to do just one thing differently, then it's all worthwhile. If you'd like to find out more about our charity, including how you can become a member to support our work and get access to more practical organic growing advice, visit gardenorganic.org.uk. We would love to welcome more people into our growing movement. Thanks to our sponsors, the Organic Gardening Catalogue, and to Kevin MacLeod for providing the music. That's it. Until next year.